Hi, and welcome to July's Cheese Club. I'm Jazz, the Quality and Operations Manager here at Paxton & Whitfield, and this month we've selected 4 cheeses to be enjoyed during the month of July. We've got 2 perhaps more classic cheeses, paired with 2 more modern cheeses, but all equally delicious, and I hope you enjoy. This is Temple Gaul. Temple Gaul is an Alpine-style cheese, and it's made in Ireland using raw cow's milk. Might have come of a bit of surprise that I've just heard that this cheese is made in Ireland, as it looks very similar to something like a Gruyere or a Comté, or cheeses which we might associate slightly more with the continent. But this is made near County Cork, and it's made by the Hegarty family, who have been making cheese with their own herd of Irish Frisian cows now for generations. In 2016, they took on a cheesemaker called Jean-Baptiste, who was a cheesemaker in the Jura region in France, an area which is famed for its Alpine-style cheeses, kind of most notably something like a Comté. And when Jean-Baptiste joined the business, together, him and the Hegartys kind of developed this cheese that you see before you today, which is Temple Gaul. So something very noticeably influenced by the continent, but with a kind of little Irish twist on it. So not only does it kind of bear a resemblance to these cheeses, they also only use the milk from the summer months. So this is because the pasture-rich diet of the cows at this time of year is ideal for this style of cheese making. So this is, again, something they've borrowed from the continent to put into this kind of very Irish cheese. Temple Gaul actually takes its name from An Timpal Gael, which is a literal Gaelic translation of the name of the cheesemaker's local village. So a very Irish named cheese made by a Frenchman and an Irishman in the style of a continental cheese. So something very unique. And something very delicious. We'll have a taste. So you see, I'll pop it down to cut it. So you can see it's got the texture of an Alpine cheese, and it's going to have a very similar flavour as well. So you're going to get that kind of nutty savouriness that you would typically get in something like a Gruyere. So it's got that dense chew that you would expect from an Alpine cheese. It's rich, it's savoury. Really nice butteriness to it, actually, which is quite typical of an Irish cheese. And a vegetal brothy as well. A really kind of complex, really interesting cheese, and something to enjoy during July. I hope you enjoy. This is Colston Basset Stilton. As the name says, this is a Stilton which is made by Colston Basset Dairy in Nottinghamshire. So Colston Basset was first built in 1913, and it was built alongside a kind of collective of farms. So back then there were 16 farms supplying milk to the dairy. Today there are only 4, and this is largely due to kind of consolidation of farms, so it still covers the same amount of land, but there are 4 farms who today supply milk to make this Stilton. In 1920, the dairy started making Stilton, but they stopped kind of during World War II, and they went back to making the cheddar style of cheese they'd been making previously. This was largely due to demand. There was a lot more demand for kind of cheddar-style cheeses during this era, during kind of rationing and the war. Over time, by the 1950s, Stilton was starting to be produced again at various points throughout the year, but not kind of all round. And then if we move on to today, Stilton is produced all year round by Colston Basset, and it's actually, alongside Shropshire Blue, the only cheese that they make and what they're most famous for. So Stilton has a PDO, which is a protected designation of origin, which means there are rules around making Stilton. And there are only a few dairies today who are allowed to make Stilton. So it has to be made in Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire, or Leicestershire, has to be made with pasteurised milk. So there are certain kind of stipulations to making a Stilton cheese and being able to call it Stilton. Colston Basset being the smallest producer of that these days. So they hand ladle all their cheese, which means that the curds are ladled by hand into the moulds. This leads to a much richer texture. If you're more delicate with the curds, they don't break up as much. So the pieces of curd stay larger, which leads to a much more kind of rich and buttery cheese. So the milk is inoculated with what we call Penicillium roqueforti, and then the curds are kind of popped into the mould, left for 5 days, and then they're kind of rubbed up with a butter knife, a really traditional way of making Stilton. The cheese then heads into a maturation room for a couple of weeks until it's pierced. So the kind of blue mould lies dormant in the cheese until this point. The stainless steel needles kind of, they poke the cheese, and then that awakens this Penicillium roqueforte, leading to the blue molds inside. So if you take a look at the cheese, you'll see these lines here. This is from the needles going in, and then that kind of spreads, that mold is awakened within the cheese, which I think is a really interesting way of making cheese, and it's something that will always fascinate me, is how blue cheeses are blue. So the mold kind of lies dormant until the oxygen penetrates the paste of the cheese. So as I said, this is a really classic cheese, really traditional British cheese. It's a proper Stilton with a PDO. So if we have a taste, so we have a quick look at the rind first. That is all edible as well. So definitely I would have a taste with the cheese, with the rind, without the rind, and see kind of how we feel. Let's have a little piece now. So the texture is like cold butter. So really smooth, really dense, really rich, creamy, slightly earthy, a little bit of piquancy, nice salt level. A really well-balanced and well-rounded example of Stilton. And I hope you enjoy. This is Taleggio. Taleggio is a soft, washed-rind cow's milk cheese made in Italy. So Taleggio is mentioned as early as the 11th century, so super old historic cheese. But back then, it was made exclusively in the Val Taleggio of Bergamo, and it was matured in the caves of Valsasanas. Please excuse my Italian pronunciation there. But it actually wasn't marketed as Taleggio back then. It was kind of known under a different name, which was Stracchino. And this comes from the local dialect of strach, which means tired or exhausted. And it's actually quite an apt name and a little joke, because it related to the cows being tired or exhausted, because the cheese was made using only autumn and winter milk. And this was after the cows had made their journey from the top of the Alps, down the pastures, into the lower plains where they graze in the autumn winter, as opposed to the top of the hills where they graze in the spring summer. So it's a little joke that the cow's milk was tired when they made this cheese. Not necessarily the case today, and now it bears the name Taleggio. So Taleggio is actually a protected cheese. It has what we call a PDO, protected designation of origin. And in 1955, laws were passed that meant that the production couldn't be copied. And then in 1988, these were strengthened again to say that this cheese could only be made in a specific region or in specific areas in Italy. So it's got these kind of protections on it as a historic and a classic cheese. As I said, it's a washed rind cheese. So if we look at the rind, you'll see it's kind of orange colour. It might have some white, grey, blue molds on it. That's very typical for this style of cheese. And it's washed in a brine solution. So washing cheese is a very traditional technique of cheese. You've got other cheeses such as Epoisse, Stinking Bishop, Rollright, Mont d'Or. They're all washed in certain things. So some are washed in brine, some are washed in alcohol. And this is a very historic way of kind of maturing and looking after cheese, very historic style of cheese. Let's have a taste. So the rind's all completely edible, and a fairly integral part of the cheese as well. When you taste it, you might get a bit of grit from the rind. That's completely normal and quite typical of this style. So let's have a taste. It's milky, fruity. It's got that kind of melt in the mouth, smooth texture. A really Moorish texture as well. It's something I would call a session cheese. You can eat quite a lot of that texture. Really subtle, really delicate, but then a little bit of a punch from the rind. So a really nice, well-balanced cheese. Perfect for melting as well. You'll typically see Taleggio melted in quite a lot of Italian dishes, but equally delicious, enjoyed on a cheese board. And I hope you enjoy. This is Doorstone. Doorstone is an ash-coated goat's milk cheese, and it's made in Herefordshire, in Hay-on-Wye, by Charlie Westhead and his team at Nealshard Creamery. So the dairy is actually located on the Doorstone Hill, hence where the cheese gets its name from. They're really small-scale production, which means they have control over all aspects of the make and also of their dairy. So, for example, the environment is a big passion of the cheesemakers, and so all their electricity is sourced by ethical suppliers, and as much as possible is generated on their on-site windmill. Their heating is handled by a custom furnace where they burn locally sourced wood. So having control over the process of the cheese make, and even as far as the kind of power and electricity, the heating of the dairy is super important to them, and kind of just shows their attention to detail. So Doorstone, as I said, ash-coated goat's milk cheese. And it's made by setting the curd really slowly overnight. It's then gently ladled by hand, so using hand, like a ladle by hand, onto a mat to allow it to drain. Then it's mixed with the salt and put in molds. This gives it this really like signature kind of fluffy texture and a really like gentle acidity. After the 24 hours it's been drained, it's then coated in edible ash. So you see this has got a black rind to it. So all completely edible. I would definitely give the cheese a go with the rind. When we cut into it, you'll see the difference between that stark kind of dark ash-coated rind and the really white paste of the cheese. You might also see these kind of white, fluffy, grey, blue spots on the cheese. These are all completely normal, and they often develop on this style of cheese during maturation. So don't be alarmed if you see kind of grey, blue, white molds on the ash, on the rind as well. Okay, let's cut into this. So you can see it's got a really unique shape. This kind of large cork-shaped cheese, which is quite unique to Doorstone in the UK. Okay, so if we look on the inside, you'll see the cheese is a lot whiter than on the outside, quite typical with goat's milk. Okay. So when I cut with a knife, it's fairly firm, but you can still feel it's got a little bit of fluff to it. It smells really fresh, really light. It's really clean. It's quite rich, kind of dense but fluffy. And it's got a really gentle acidity. There's a really nice lemoniness coming through, really milky. I said that acidity is quite gentle, so it's not too harsh up front, which you can get with some other goat's cheese. And that lemony, fresh, kind of really bright, really clean flavours. A really nice, delicate goat's cheese, but isn't overly goaty. And I hope you enjoy.